Matt Sharkey, at long last, welcome to Second Nature. Good to see you, buddy.
Great to see you guys. Thanks for having me.
Broadcasting from Aaron Lutzi's basement. Go ahead, Aaron.
We finally got him on the pod. We've been pestering you for not a short amount of time. So thank you
Well,
for being here.
very, very honored to be here. I love what you guys are doing. If you wouldn't have, I probably would have at some point. So I'm happy to piggyback um, this brilliant concept. So thank you.
And thanks to you, we are viral on LinkedIn, Matt Sharkey. For those who don't know, we've obviously mentioned your name a million times here on the show, but you've helped to curate some awesome job opportunities in the space, which you were doing on your own personal LinkedIn profile. And then out of the kindness of your heart, you said, hey, this may feel better living on the Second Nature LinkedIn profile. And you've been helping us to grow an audience there. We appreciate it.
No, I'm happy to do it. I think depending upon who you ask, maybe I need to find some new hobbies. But armchair recruiter is a strange one, I think, for a CMO. But I love seeing people end up in the right roles, working on the right projects for the right people, and very happy for that to live with you guys now, and hopefully build what you're building.
It's so funny because our respective paths have all crossed in a really interesting way. I feel like Sharkey, you and I
Yeah,
worked together when you were at the North Face. We'll talk about that. Obviously, you and Aaron have connected in other ways. We all know very similar people, run in similar circles, and I feel like the three of us are kindred spirits in a lot of ways. And
totally agree.
really, really grateful to have you here on the podcast. Aaron's favorite question here for our guests. He's a big hero's journey guy. So maybe we just start with a basic one of, what was your call to adventure? You started in this industry from a very young age and you've had an incredible career, a lot of which we'll touch on here today. But can you identify like the initial spark that drew you to outdoor action sports?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a couple of contributing factors. I grew up in the suburbs of Silicon Valley, and suburbs anywhere are just a strange concept. You're not tied to a rural, community. You're not tied to a mountain community. It's just these sprawling streets. And so for me, and having a dad who was kind of deeply engaged in the early days of Silicon Valley, um, natural effort as a teenager, I wanted nothing to do with it, right? And so I just wanted to get outside and be outside. And the first things that took me were cycling and climbing predominantly. And I just so happened to live a mile and a half away from an REI. And so that became the first place for me where I kind of connected with community. And was very eager to extend beyond just the retail floor. So I was in the climbing and backpacking section as a specialist, but within the first year, I started running community events as well. So like anytime authors would come by and do slideshows and all that, I got heavily engaged there. So that's where the bug first came and kind of grew from there.
One of the things that I have here listed on your bio is that while you were actually working in some of these shops growing up, you also kicked off kind of a zine, which back in the day before the internet was how we spread word of mouth and shared information with one another. This is pre-podcast,
Right.
pre.com. The zine, how does that inform everything that you've done since? Did it make a big impact in how you think about communicating a message, or just is it a lost art? What do you think?
Yeah, no, I mean, I'll say having kids that are 18 and 24 and seeing the fact that the zine still lives. And I think that it lives now in contrast to being so inundated in a digital environment that people are now finding that same path for a very different reason. For me, it was the way to communicate at the time. And now it's this like anti-digital path of like the scarcity and the rarity of it. And you got to hunt and find it. I think that that's why I'm also have such a kinship for what you guys are doing, both with Free Trail and with Second Nature. Is my whole path in marketing came from that start. I mean, my, air quotes MBA came from building a zine into a magazine, taking that from local backyard distribution to having distribution throughout the US and then parts of Europe. There's no question that it directly impacted my career. I had paid advertising within 9 months of launching, and visiting with advertisers a year later to say thank you turned into my first job offer within marketing. And so I think it also really informs my deep love still for print media and digital media, to be honest. But I am, uh, like you, Debo, I subscribe to like almost every single print publication I can get my hands on that's anywhere around outdoor, run, cycling, etc. I'm also uh, hyper aware that those are bottom of the funnel publications, and we still need the top of the funnel publications in order to bring more people into our sports. And so I find a lot of people that love print as much as I do want to just favor that and get behind that and support it. But without the outside medias of the world, we don't get people that are just curious, into our spaces as well. So I love that we can all coexist here and go deep on niche. But yeah, I hold a very special place in my heart for people that are taking on that endeavor.
It's funny, and I think you do a lot of your photography on analog film too. So
I
print
do.
magazines.
Yeah, these are my ways to slow down, to be honest. My career path has been so accelerated that for me to kind of step outside of the boardroom, like it's very intentional that I shoot with film exclusively, because every time you click the shutter, that's $4. So you better really think about what you're framing and taking your time. And then you don't get any instant gratification. You got to wait till you're developing and processing. And so that's my zen and my way of leaving the boardroom and leaving kind of, that high level, high intensity to slow down.
What a beautiful thing.
It's amazing that you started off, and we talk about this pretty frequently, of people who sort of raise their hand to do something and then that turns into the next thing and the next thing. And of course, like, you're saying all the right words for me, where content is really like the foundation and the pillar, and becoming good at content is what really sets you off on that journey, that call to adventure, as we like to call it. But really, people that are looking to get into these worlds, it doesn't always happen from just being good at what you do. It's that you did pick up the reins, you did create something, and something like a zine requires no permission. It requires, 5 cents per copy at the copier at Kinko's, right? It's not something that you have to go and ask anybody's permission. You can just make stuff, and if you're on point, then it will turn into something with paid advertising, and will turn into the first job, which leads to the second job, which leads to, being a big time CMO now.
Yeah, I think what I recognized very early on was that I was not going to be the professional athlete. Like, I am highly inspired by professional athletes, and particularly those within outdoor adventure action sports, like that were very much more the niche, when I was growing up in the 80s. And certainly some have grown to be much larger now. But so I saw my place in the world, I guess, as a storyteller. As I was the one that was going to surround myself with these people and be the person to try and help build their career or tell their story, and then weave in that content piece. And I recognized early on I was okay with that. Whereas I think I had a lot of peers that were like, I'm going to keep slogging at this until I make it. I recognized where my value could be, and what felt most comfortable to me. And, that's probably less aspirational to an athlete, but maybe aspirational to somebody who's trying to chase a career in these spaces.
That's really interesting, because it feels like that's something that the three of us all share, right? Lutzi was a sponsored athlete, but correct me if I'm wrong, but Aaron, the biggest way that you sort of established a foothold and have built the career that you have is because you've been a great storyteller in the mountain biking community. And it's sort of been the opposite for me, where I was a professional athlete. And now, as I sort of age out of competition, I'm discovering my storytelling ability. And so that's maybe a thread that ties the three of us together. But to be more specific about the zine, it was a skateboarding publication. And I'd love to have you comment, because we haven't spoken about skating as much on the show, but I just view the history of the sport as being fascinating and also instructive for sports like trail running that are, also on the ascent, though several years or a couple of decades behind in terms of development. So maybe just talk about what initially drew you to skateboarding, because in that time it was very much a counterculture thing, where now the top athletes are highly paid professionals competing in the Olympics,
Yeah,
right?
right.
So maybe
Yeah.
you could comment on just like what drew you to skateboarding and the evolution of it over time since you've been connected to it for
Yeah.
a while.
No, happy to. And I can make that direct parallel to my love of trail running now as a sport. I think the the parallels between the two are incredibly strong. For me, yes, skateboarding was largely born as a method of transportation to get to the ocean for surfers in Southern California. But the very second level of that was it was the suburbs. It was people that could build a ramp in their backyard or have something on their front yard. And that was absolutely the community I grew up in. Like it went from BMX to skateboarding, from skateboarding to mountain biking. That was like I grew up around a bunch of guys that were 3 and 4 years older than I was, and that was the trajectory that I followed along. But I also, just from a culture perspective, because I grew up in it or in the '80s, I got to see how it informed so many other things. And what I mean by that is, it, the argument of is it a lifestyle, is it art, is it a sport? That argument continues to this day. And I love to see people get heated over it for sure. But it impacted so many things in culture, like between art, like if you see, um, you know, artists that have grown up in and around it, how it's impacted streetwear, all of these ties that were born truly from skateboarding, largely skateboarding, punk rock, and hip hop. Like those three things in combination, like really drove culture in the '80s and '90s. Where I draw the parallels now, I would say that's what really interested me then. I've watched that entire industry mature over those years. And in the early part of my career, for the first decade, I worked almost exclusively around board sports. Um, where I see the parallel now with trail running is in my era of skateboarding, there in the '80s there was 7 or 8 superstars and there was 2 brands, but in the '90s it totally died. As soon as like skate parks dried up across the country due to legal reasons, there was no more area, so there was no more like anything formal to bring people together. And so it was on the backs of skateboarders that they had to build their community. And I've seen that entirely with trail running over the last
Mm.
decade. It is like this, it's this insular community. You will never see another group of athletes like you will trail runners, where they're around the start finish line together, encouraging each other, knowing that like there's only a handful of people that are making a living doing it. And there was only a handful of brands that were interested in its onset. Um, and so that community had to just be entirely supportive of each other. And that was exactly what skateboarding was in the '90s. And so, will trail running have as much of an impact on culture? Remains to be determined, but
If
it's
it's
still
up to
fun to
me,
watch now.
Dare to
Yeah, that's right.
dream.
Yeah.
Here's a question that I've always wanted to ask someone who kind of came up in the skate industry and has, ties to it. One of the things that I think skateboarding does better than every other sport, including mainstream sports, is they take amazing care of the legends of the sport. So you think about Mark Gonzalez, Steve Caballero, like these are guys who are in like their 60s at this point that are still drawing a living from their career as skateboarders. I can't think of a single example of that other than maybe Michael Jordan, who's got a, signature brand with Nike. I can't think of any other real scenario where let's just say past their prime as a skater, they're still getting taken care of and treated like the legend that they are. What do you
Yeah.
think makes that environment possible? And how might brands or how might sports like trail running or mountain biking consider, like, how do you get to that? I don't know.
Yeah. I think there's two threads there. The first thread is the nature of skateboarding, and the fact that it is such a young sport still relatively. So these legends that were huge in the '80s are still alive and engaged, and on a daily basis. They don't just show up to one event. They're there throughout their community, year round. But also, it was born from this like latchkey kid, mentality, where in the '80s it was not parents supporting it. Like these were like the outlaw athletes, of their time. It was There wasn't structure, there wasn't competition, and so the industry itself really was built by these individuals, and they're recognized as such. And there's because it's such a young sport, there's been generation after generation is kind of really informed about who these people are. And as long as you can continue to contribute, it doesn't mean that you need to continue to compete. It doesn't mean you need to continue to um, put on demos. It's like you're appreciated for the style and the way in which you contributed. And so we continue to talk about you. You continue to make an impression on the industry. That was something, to be honest, though, that I was hyper aware of when I came to the North Face to oversee sports marketing. There were a lot of athletes that had been with the brand for a couple decades plus. And I don't think, in all of my career that has woven in and out of sports marketing a ton, there haven't been a lot of brands that have really considered how you take an athlete through the entire arc of their career. And so, especially in these sports where we have a lot of them, climbing, cycling, and certainly, skateboarding outside of the North Face, but where people start at incredibly young ages. And it's like, okay, you're starting 13, 14, you're peaking in your career in your 20s, but it's all you've ever known. So what do you do when you're in your 30s? And I think that certain brands have taken the time more recently to think about, how do we bring more people into the industry, and how do we think about them cross functionally in ways that maybe they aren't even thinking themselves. I think the natural progression has always been what I've seen is you're an athlete, you typically become an athlete manager, or you work in marketing in some capacity. But the reality is you've been around product your whole life. Maybe product is where you should be going as you think about, leaving the competitive side of things. Maybe you're just a great ambassador and you're meant to be a sales rep. Like there's so many ways that, especially with these larger companies, to think about how their athlete can come back into the fold, and think about the evolution of their career rather than just thanks, we used you when you were at the height and now it's on you to figure out, your second chapter.
Or the culture so intimately, you start a podcast or you print a zine,
Yes, there we go.
Wait,
That's right.
sticking on this, you just touched on something I think would be fascinating to have you comment on, because in that early day of skate culture, as you said, it was latchkey kids, right? It was the anti-jocks. Like it
Yep.
wasn't a sport. And I
Right.
know that's been part of the friction in the growth of it starting as this thing that was not really sport, not really competition. Now, as I said, it's an Olympic sport and with highly paid professional athletes who are approaching it with that type of a mindset.
Yeah.
So going from counterculture to very much an established sort of big industry at this point. And trail running sort of has a similar progression where it started as a grassroots sort of outdoorsy endurance athlete, introverted person
Mm-hmm.
who was just coming to the start line to push themselves through some personal curiosity. And now, like we're saying, I'm going to UTMB next week. There's almost no sporting event that feels as professional, as big, and as organized as UTMB. And similarly, trail running, especially in the last 2 years, has gone through this like really deep episode of friction, which you came to TrailCon and we talked all
Yep.
about it there. So any parallels you can paint there of like the progression of sport over time, especially in these niche communities?
Yeah, I think, to be totally honest, I think the tension is always going to be there. I don't think it ever goes away, but I think that there's a way for things to evolve healthfully. And I think that tension is part of that health, to be honest, and I think that I'll hear the argument, and I've been around it, my whole life, certainly parts of my career, but even just on a personal level, having deep ties to people that are still involved in the skateboarding industry, is the argument of, is it a sport or is it not? Should it be in the Olympics or should it not? And I can't answer for the whole industry, but I can give my perspective. And my perspective is skateboarding is likely, to many people, a very personal endeavor. And I honestly think trail running to many people is likely a highly personal endeavor. And some people are going to be fine with just pushing a skateboard down the street, and that's going to give them the greatest feeling ever in the world. And how they express themselves through that is all that matters to them. Similarly, with somebody who's going to go hit a trail this afternoon, there are other people that they love the competition of it and they thrive off of it and they want to be able to make a career off of it because it's something that they love so much. I personally am 100% in support of skateboarding being in the Olympics. Does it mean that everybody who touches a skateboard should aspire to be at the top of the pyramid and um, drive their entire lives towards that pursuit of competition? Absolutely not. Like their interpretation of it is their interpretation of it. But I think the more that people have awareness about skateboarding and the more people that get interested in it, the more that it helps people be outside and active, and it helps an industry grow. Every time that we've seen competition get bigger in skateboarding, the industry itself has grown. And I would argue that the same thing will be true for trail running. The more that there are, regional runs, regional races, national stage races, people that want to be at that level, like, will rise, interest in and health in the industry as well.
One thing that I wanted to get you to comment on, maybe both of you guys could comment on this, is you mentioned that you have two kids, 18 and 24.
Mm-hmm.
That means both you and Lutzi had kids when you were really young.
Yeah.
And I would love to hear you both, like, because Lutzi and I have talked about this on the show, but I know for Aaron, that was a big motivating factor in building the career that he did, both inside of sport and on the brand side. So maybe you could comment on that too, because having a kid at a young age is definitely a motivator.
It certainly is. I think without question, it really accelerated my career. I think for the first like 5 or 6 years of my career, I wanted to be a sponge, and I was just trying to learn as much as I possibly could. But I was also okay with, like, being an athlete manager for multiple years in action sports, which was great and sent me around the world. But it wasn't going to be something that I could live off of or grow a family from. And so, it was an accelerator, being I have multiple mouths to feed. I need to think about my career path and, like, what does that look like over time? And I can't wait for that. I need to drive that proactively. But it also, because I was still so young, I think both of my sons, and certainly my oldest son, had a front row seat to this just like incredible world of like action sports and music and like being inspired at that level, to, however anybody can provide for their family, I'm going to tip my hat to you. But I do know a lot of friends' dads who worked a desk job that hated it and came home, and that misery was very well felt and experienced by their kids and the rest of the family. I have been incredibly fortunate to have a remarkable career working for incredible brands, global level brands. And I think the level of joy that brings me, it was very apparent to my kids from very young ages. And I think it's, while they may choose similar paths or very different paths, at least knowing that the reward of doing what you love and what that can do for you over time is the goal.
Just for our listeners, that's going to be a perfect callback for my BPC here later at the end of the episode.
All right.
What do you got,
I'd be curious to hear your take on that, Lutzi.
Well, I think that the best thing about it is, I mean, having a child at a young age really is a motivating factor in a lot of different ways, like you said. I think one of the things is that if I think about what I would have done had I not had a kid so young, I probably would have been very complacent. I would have been an athlete. I would have been happy just like surviving as an athlete. And I think that not only having a kid, but the progression of their growth, knowing that not only do I have to feed him now, but in 20 years, I got to put him through college. You have to continue advancing. So it's not enough to just be like, oh, I should probably maybe switch my focus from riding bikes to getting a job in the industry. It was like, oh, I should get an industry job, but then I should be hustling hard to get the next job up from that and the next job up from that. And so it's this motivating factor in a progressive way as well. I also think one of the benefits, and you kind of touched on it, is that your kids develop this really cool relationship with meeting people that are sort of influential or world champions or whatever. And they get a chance to see these famous people, for lack of a better term, as normal people, and they're able to interact with these people because they don't understand the context and they don't care about the context.
Hmm.
And when they grow up around that, then they're able to function speaking to anyone because
Right.
it doesn't matter. And I think that was one of the secrets to success for a lot of athlete managers, is just not getting overwhelmed or intimidated by people who had some, world championship stripes or whatever. It's
Yeah.
everybody's just a normal person. And I mean, Sharky, more than anybody, you've worked with bands, you've worked with athletes, you've worked with big mega Silicon Valley people. Like, it's really just like leveling with someone on a personal level. And I think for our kids to see us interacting with lead singer of No Doubt, for
Yeah.
example, or whatever,
Yeah.
I think that's important for them to see that everybody's, and giving them a little bit of grounding in that way too. I think is super important.
I totally agree.
It's an interesting comment of like exposing kids to what would feel like unorthodox experiences at a young age makes them comfortable in maybe uncomfortable experience what in situations or circumstances that would make other kids uncomfortable or other people uncomfortable later in life. Aaron just teased something that I would love to have you expand on here.
Hmm.
So, moving out of action sports, you also had some experience working with artists directly. And I think this is going to be interesting because in some we talk about a bit here, and some I've been in particular talking about or thinking about recently, and just the overlapping skill sets required to be successful in business, in sport, in art. Specifically, you worked in music,
Hmm.
and would love to hear about that chapter of your career and what the common thread was moving from skateboarding to working with No Doubt.
Yeah. It actually kind of, they were parallel for me early on because I ended up having a music section to my zine. So there was music being woven into that. And even before I started the zine, the No Doubt story is one. I hope stories like this continue to happen for people, but it seems pretty novel now, given the way that in which communication travels so quickly in the avenues it takes. But I saw No Doubt play their first show outside of Southern California. They came to the Bay Area. They opened for a reggae artist at a club of 300 people, and their very first album was coming out 2 months after that. They announced it that night. Their energy was incredibly infectious. I'd never seen anybody like them. So I bought the album when it came out. There was a P.O. box to their fan club, and I literally wrote a letter to that P.O. box and said, "You guys are incredible. I book some shows around the Bay Area helping my friends' bands. If you ever need help up here again, let me know." And my expectation was I was going to just be put on a fan club mailing letter and I would get, information. Well, Tony Canal, the bass player, wrote me back a handwritten letter that I still have to this day and said, "Thank you so much for your words of encouragement. We're going to have a CD release party at the Palladium in Hollywood. Would love it if you could make it down. Here's the dates." And I'm 16 years old when this happens. And clearly, I'm not getting my parents to co sign on me going down midweek on a Wednesday to a CD release party in Hollywood. So I did not make that show, but he and I continued a pen pal relationship for the next 3 to 4 years. And I would just get postcards on occasion from when they were recording. And so when I had the zine, I was equally curious about the music industry as I was about the skateboarding industry. And clearly, I ended up picking the skateboarding industry first. And one of those, as I worked in the industry, I became a bit disenfranchised with this thing that I thought that I loved and held dear, which was just the purity of skateboarding and artistic expression. And I got to see the inner workings of the industry, and I thought, maybe I don't want this. Maybe I'm just going to keep it as this special thing and not work in it. And so at that time, I ended up flying down to Southern California and setting up a couple of interviews in the music industry on the marketing side. One of them was at Interscope Records, which is the label that No Doubt's on. And I interviewed with Steve Berlman, the CMO of Interscope, and he said, "What's your background on music? What do you like?" And I expressed that, like, well, I've been in touch with Tony, the bass player of No Doubt, and I'm thinking of pursuing this after already having pursued skateboarding. And he said, "Well, there's nothing open right now, but now that I've met you, I know, where your interests lie, where your strengths are. I'll hold on to your contact. So I'm driving to my next interview, and my Motorola brick phone rings, and I open up both sides of it, and hello, and it's Tony, the bass player, no doubt. And he said, "Hey, heard you're in town." And this is way before social media or anything that would have tipped that off. And I thought, how the hell did you hear this? And he said, well, Steve just called us, wanted to verify if I actually knew you or not. And I said, oh, okay, interesting. He said, we're in the studio tonight. Come by and have dinner with us. We want to talk to you. So went to the studio, sat around for a bit during the recording, and then we went to have dinner, and it was just me and the band. And they said, look, if you want a job at a label, we'll get you a job at a label, but really we need a GM to come in and manage our fan club, our merchandise company, because they didn't outsource any merch. So work with all the designers, cut and sew, everything. At that time it was a mail order catalog.
Wow.
And then it grew to be e-commerce. And then I did all their behind the scenes photography and all their behind the scenes copywriting. And then when we would go on tour, I would oversee all merch and all the people that sold merch. So it was an incredible experience, but all just from one letter to a PO box.
Shoot your shot.
And I'm still in touch with them now. Yeah, I just went down and photographed them in Coachella just this last April. But no, that's exactly right, Debo. You don't get what you don't try.
And what an opportunity to continue to develop your creative skills. Before we press record, you made a comment about how a lot of people who hold CMO roles, executive roles, for fear of maybe doing something that would reflect poorly on their business, on their brand, on their company, they are less active, or maybe, I don't know, just less incentivized to showcase their own creativity. And I know creativity has been core to what you've done, and I'm sure you could identify ways in which it's made you much better at your job that I bet our audience would love to hear. So maybe how copywriting, how developing a skill with photography has made you a great CMO.
Yeah, no, I can definitely speak to that, at least in my experience. When I went to college originally, I went for a dual degree in education and creative writing. And my intention and thought was that I was going to be a college preparatory creative writing teacher. And that's when I started my zine, was when I was in school. And so both of those things, in terms of writing and visual storytelling, my mother's an incredible photographer. My grandfather was a professional photographer. He captured much of World War II, both from the air and from the land. And so all of that's kind of in the blood, so to speak. And so as I recognized that, I ended up doing a year of student teaching, and that thankfully taught me that I was not the right person for that incredibly hard job. And so the creative aspect is how it was my entry point into a marketing career, no question. And when I worked early on in my 20s and even into my early 30s for smaller brands, it was incredibly beneficial to have that skill set, because when a marketing department is all of 3 people, with limited budgets, I would have to act as marketing director, as art director, as creative director, and as head of production. And so in all of those shoots, I got to learn all of those skill sets. And then when my career evolved into more director and then executive level roles, I could at least have a vernacular and speak to all the things that go into content creation, that go into brand, that go into storytelling. And so, without question, highly impactful in my career to come through that lens. What it has forced me, now that I'm a CMO, like, it forced me to learn both sides. So I've had to get much stronger on growth and performance, because the native skill sets that I have come through the lens of brand and storytelling, which, if we don't continue to learn and we don't continue to force ourselves to expand our own horizons and our own skill sets, to me, that's a very boring life. So,
I want to dig into the evolution of your career, because I think a lot of people listening to this podcast are either in the outdoor industry and want to find other ways to grow their career, or they're outside the outdoor industry and they want to come in. And one of the kind of threads that I see going through your entire career is you've kind of been on both sides of the coin. You've been, into skateboarding and outdoor brands like the North Face, but then you've also been in some Silicon Valley startups. How would you characterize that, or what would be, how did you make the move in a way? I feel like you need to have a high level of credibility coming into the outdoor space, but then moving into the Silicon Valley, it's like is it a completely different skill set, or how would you characterize that?
It's definitely a different audience. I think the two things that have really driven my career has been A, curiosity, and B, um, loving consumer and loving brand. Like, to use too many, internal terminologies there, but I am fascinated by what interests people and what drives their decision making. And I am obsessed with like what goes into building, creating, and furthering, just the best brands that we've ever seen. And so that curiosity really has driven me from, being within the industry, outside of it, but also, and then having all of these, adjacencies that have taken me to different product categories. So, I came up through hard goods, and then recognized that the greater growth was going to come from within footwear and apparel. And so I just proactively channeled myself in that direction, so that I would have larger global opportunities. And then one example, even with Cliff Bar, like CPG was not really, wasn't huge yet in outdoor. Like, early days, and I'm talking 90s, it was Power Bar and it was Gatorade, and that was it. And so when Cliff came to me to run sports marketing, I thought it as a huge opportunity to stay within sports that I was passionate about, within communities that I was passionate about, but learn an entirely different industry where, food and beverage is very different than shoes and apparel. Channel perspective, thinking about category. Obviously, there were a portfolio of brands, distribution. How do I take it from Fleet Feet to Target and everything in between? And so, like, really pushing myself to get again outside of my comfort zone and learn a new industry, learn from new consumers.
Having worked in across 4 or 5 different industries, I have a very unique position to understand consumer very broadly. These people, receive communications differently. Distribution is different. How you approach a consumer in an omni-channel perspective. Now I can learn from food and CPG. I can learn from tech. I have learned from outdoor. I've learned from endurance and adventure and action sports. So all of that, has just afforded me a very broad understanding of communicating to consumers, and that's been a tremendous advantage to me personally. I think if you look at my resume and you're interviewing me, you might be like, wait a second, this is a very nonlinear path, to which I'll agree. But I feel like I have gained more than that has been a hindrance, for sure.
Oh, I'm sure that's an advantage in a lot of cases. And maybe the key theme that our audience could take away from this is the importance of proactivity. You've used that word a couple of times, going back to just having the proactive energy to start your own zine, and then getting into hard goods, and then being proactively interested in soft goods, and then being proactive to send that message to No Doubt. And then, coming back to, you had mentioned that you sort of got disenfranchised with skating and the skate industry, but ultimately you did come back before going to Cliff Bar. So maybe you could kind of bring that story full circle, like what called you back to the industry?
Yeah, I had a friend who was a professional skateboarder pass very young, 25, of heart failure. And when that happened, I thought a lot about his legacy, because he brought this incredible energy. Like, he just wanted to get everyone stoked on skateboarding. And everything he did, though, I mean, he'd love to go fishing. He'd love to be outdoors. Everything he did with like such incredible energy. And I felt like there's a bit in skateboarding and any other clique and every other sport under the sun in outdoor sports too. There's a bit of like protecting of space, and like I'm cooler than you. And Tim, in this particular instance, he let everybody in. He didn't want to put up guarded walls about anything. And I thought, skateboarding in particular at that time, there was just a lot of negative energy. And I was like, it needs more people like him to like really carry it forward. And so that's what drew me back. And I came in at that time to NHS, which is the parent company to Santa Cruz Skateboards. And it definitely afforded me the opportunity to be in skateboarding, which was very familiar, but also to learn more, because at the time they had snowboards and surfboards, and they had wheel brands, truck brands, and a couple different apparel offerings for all of those brands. So this huge like house of brands where I could learn a lot from. And even later, when I launched my own consultancy and agency, I helped build the Levi's skateboarding program, and that was much later in my career. So I came back like a decade after being gone, back in again, and at a very different stage with a very different partner. To be with, within skateboarding with one of the largest apparel brands in the world is a very different experience than an endemic brand.
This is really cool because when you look at it on paper, it definitely looks like it's just a mess of side quests. But actually, each one of these steps is kind of like a leapfrog where you're in the outdoor industry working on something. Then you go out and do this thing where you pick up this new skills, working in CPG, for example. Then you come back and then you're even stronger than you were in the previous role. It's like this really cool way to see you kind of jump up and just acquiring all these different skills and experiences in a really effective way that I think would be really hard to do if you just stayed in the outdoor industry the entire time and kind of fought tooth and nail to make that next step up.
Yeah, no, what I would hope, what feels true to me is when I've been able to step away from an industry and still stay engaged with it just out of a personal interest, but now I'm looking at it through consumer lens rather than through executive lens, I can pick it apart a lot better in my mind. And I might be right, I might be wrong in my observations, but I can really be critical. And I think that that's necessary. And I think that an outside perspective is very helpful in those scenarios. Like when you're too close to the Kool-Aid, you are less reticent to see, what's wrong with it.
It's my favorite one is success theater. Like when you're in the mix and you're just finding the way that it makes it sound best.
Yeah.
There's a lot of success theater when it comes to brands everywhere, outdoor or not.
No, I totally agree.
Okay, so we got to skip over a bunch of the stuff that you've done. And like I said, this is going to be the first of many pods with Matt Sharkey. You've had an incredible career, and there's so much insight to glean from you. You mentioned setting up your own consultancy. At this point, we've really talked about you working on the brand side with outside of your initial entrepreneurial endeavor of your zine. You were sort of working for established businesses. And now when you set up At the Workbench, you're sort of going on your own, setting up your own agency, which requires a different mindset and a different skill set. And would love to hear you just sort of talk about that. Any particularly hard learnings that came from really setting up your own shop?
Yeah, absolutely. My career to that point had been entirely client side. I'd always been curious and interested about the agency side, just because of the pace in which it moves and the fact that you get to work with a bunch of different brands on a bunch of different campaigns or endeavors. And so I was always curious to that side. And by the leading up to the launch of my consultancy and agency, I had had a lot of inbounds from people. I'm at that point 15 years plus in my career, and people were like, man, I wish you had your own thing going. I'd love to pull you in for this strategy conversation, or I'd love to like get your thinking around campaign development, full brand strategy, building something from the ground up. So the more that I got those coming inbound, the more that I started to consider it. And I got to that point where I said, it's now or never. I don't want to look back and say, what if I would have done? So and to be honest, my kids were at the right ages to do that as well. They were in high school and junior high. I could take 2 hours off in an afternoon and be engaged in one of their, sporting events, and then work 2 hours longer at night. So it was a perfect right fit. I'd say the real hard learnings, or at least great learnings for me on a personal level, was I didn't do it, and I don't want to discredit any really strong agencies out there, but the way that agencies succeed over time is you're winning awards. You're proving that you can be the best, at developing campaigns and strategies for people. And so it's like there's that you go in, you develop something, you hand it off, and you don't have the ownership over it long term, right? Typically. So I wasn't interested. I did not come into marketing to win awards. And even on the client side, I don't personally have an interest of ever being on a 50 under 50 list. My career is not for my ego. My career is how can I add value to and contribute to a brand? How can I grow sustained growth over time? And how can I lift others up and be an ally in their career? Like, that's why I'm in it. And so I recognized when I was doing the consultancy and the agency, I had Levi's as an anchor client for 6 years. That's great business. I helped build 2 new business units for them, had great success. As a consultant and as your own agency, you can make far more money than you can being client side. What I recognized personally was I really missed being on the client side. I missed the highs and lows, mentoring a team and owning the outcome. And so kind of 7 years into it, I recognized, okay, I'm going to slow the agency down and I'm going to look for in-house roles again, because I don't think there is a better or worse decision. I think it just comes down to what you personally want to get out of your career and your life. And for me,
7 years is a good run too.
Yeah. I ended up, and it was 7 years. And then I went to the North Face.
Hold on. Yeah. I want to get to that, but maybe while we're on this subject, you also built a cool retail establishment, which is another entrepreneurial endeavor. I guess that comes later in the timeline. Should we talk about that now or TNF first?
Yeah, those were actually pretty in parallel. We launched the retail store, my family and I did, prior to TNF. And yeah, that was an extension. My wife and kids really responsible for like the day-to-day operation of that store, but they were very generous with their time and their support because it was absolutely my vision, and something I had wanted to do for a very long time. I think I just had this conversation with a friend last week. I have journals dating back to 2008, 2009, when I first started concepting it out, and we opened in 2016. So, timing was interesting for sure. It was an apparel menswear store that was in Sonoma County that was largely inspired by this like vintage sport aesthetic, largely leaning in on baseball. But most of the brands that we carried were predominantly made in the US. I really wanted to think more about that kind of bringing, a halo back around local manufacturing. It's something that has been largely lost in our country, and I wanted to really highlight the brands who are dedicating themselves towards it. It also allowed us, just the way that we curated and the level that we curated, we were the only account like between San Francisco and Portland for like New Balance, Made in the USA, PF Flyers, Carhartt Work in Progress, like a bunch of brands that you just don't find typically outside of major metro areas. So incredible experience. Timing was a little off leading up to all things pandemic even, and also just recognizing how tremendously full-time retail is on a family that's trying to run a store by yourselves. The fact that we were able to take 4 days off as a family in year 2 felt tremendous. And I think we all recognize that that was something that we didn't want to rob ourselves of, and so retail, very challenging, but incredibly rewarding. It gave us our entire community of where we live and all of our personal friends. We, in the month of October, would stay open until the last out of any baseball game that was happening during the playoffs. And when you're in Sonoma County, you're surrounded by incredible food, incredible craft breweries, and incredible distilleries. And all of those became part of our family. And so there was food and libations until 11 o'clock, 7 nights a week in the month of October. So we became kind of the free speakeasy where the whole community gathered around sport. And it was really, really, really cool. Some of the best memories of my life.
Rad. Yeah. All right. So for our listeners, let's come to the TNF part of the story now. Yeah. And I'm going to recount a fun episode and then ask you to, reflect on it too. See if my memory is the same as yours. But I think it was the end of 2018. My contract had come to an end. Mm-hmm. This is right as the North Face was in the middle of their move from the Bay Area here, Alameda to Denver, where their corporate office is now.
Mm-hmm.
And I had already sort of like verbally agreed to terms on my new contract. And then at the 11th hour, like right around Christmas,
Mm-hmm.
I got a competing offer from a different brand that I had to consider.
Yeah.
And I remember texting you on like Christmas Eve and saying, "Hey, Sharkey, can we get on the phone
Yep.
here, buddy? I'm sorry to do this, but like something came up here."
You came with a very genuine apology on that, and I was totally fine for it. I'm always excited to see an athlete have more than one option, and I'm down to be in on the negotiations there and just make sure that you and or the brand get the best that they possibly can. But yeah, I don't ever delete a text message ever. So I still have that communication between you and I. And it went very smoothly and very quickly and very easily. So thank you. I think it was a 36-hour negotiation, and we were off to the races.
Yeah.
Amazing.
So yeah, it's funny again, like our paths intersect in weird ways over the course of time. And that was an important moment in my career. I obviously stayed with the North Face for another cycle after that, but maybe this would be a fun thing for you guys to riff on as we sort of eventually have to come to a close here in this version 1 of the pod. But, you know, having been on the athlete side and like having so much experience across a diverse set of industries, starting in skateboarding, you know, obviously working at Cliff where you oversaw a huge team. The North Face, obviously sports marketing is core to everything they do. Lutzi has similar experience working at Red Bull, another brand that's known for their athlete marketing, also at Aura. I'd love to hear both you guys just like meditate a little bit or riff together on the evolution of athlete marketing, sports marketing over time.
Yeah, Lucy, you want to take that first, or do you want me to go?
Nice, real nice. You know, I think when it really comes down to, and I've been in the room with the number 1 athlete marketing head person from Red Bull, and there was a period of time when some athlete managers would try to sell in a specific sport or athlete based on the amount of cans they thought that signing that athlete would be able to deliver for the brand, specifically when we're going into like basketball or some of these other mainstream sports. And I remember this moment with the head of sports marketing for the entire brand. And he said, "Timeout. I don't really care if I could attribute a single sale of a can of Red Bull to an athlete. That's actually not why we do this." And he went on to kind of talk about the value of athletes to the brand and why it was just the core of the brand and the message and the credibility of the brand, and how much meaning came from the relationship with the athlete. And I really felt that because as an athlete manager, I drew a lot of meaning from those relationships. And I think that in my role, it was about translating the meaning that I felt from the relationship with that athlete to a higher level, trying to get that out to the wider audience to have them feel that same excitement that I felt. And we've tried to find clever ways to connect athletes directly to the product. And I think Red Bull, there is a sort of direct connection, but also in a lot of ways some indirect connections, whereas maybe North Face is a little bit different because you are actually running in the shoes and the gear and whatever. But I think that was a really important lesson for everyone to get directly from the top of the top, saying, we're not doing it for sales. We're doing it for the relationship, for the meaning that comes out of this relationship.
Right. Yep. I love that perspective, and I think that's spot on. I think I'm going to age myself a bit, but in the start of my career, I got to see sport and athlete marketing through a pretty impactful lens of what I had seen, and doesn't represent industries in total, but what I had seen was a lot of the athlete managers, or even sports marketing managers, even when you get up into like, you know, AB InBev or like, you know, food, larger, you know, commoditized brands, right? There is this look at athlete as commodity. So this is just another vehicle for our brand. And so looking at a person as a commodity, then there's the athlete manager that's the starstruck person that just wants to hang out with the cool athletes. And then there's, I think, what I saw as an opportunity, and not only for myself, certainly for others, was look, an athlete needs a brand and a brand needs an athlete. And so walk the fence line. Be what the athlete needs you to be what the brand needs you to be, and be the negotiator on their behalf. So, internally, you're basically an agent, but you're the agent not only just for the athlete, you're the agent for the brand as well. And so, like, our responsibility, our role was, let's make sure that each party is getting the best of what they can get out of this relationship. And I kind of helped, hang my hat on that being my objective early on in my career. Was like, I want to make sure that I wanted to be the bridge builder. I didn't want to be like, how can we use you up and spit you out? And I didn't want you to be the athlete side saying, how can I milk this sponsor for everything they've got? It's like, no, let's look at what we can both bring to the table, and let's execute the best things that we can on each other's behalf. And so I think that early on really was important to me and resonated with me. I think how sports marketing in general and athlete marketing has really changed and shifted in my career has, early on, it was entirely about the podium, in outdoor and endurance sports, without question. Action sports, it always had that bend where you could go towards the podium, or you could be the style king of whatever you did and have somebody resonate with you. And now you guys talk about it a lot, on the pod. Are you a podium athlete, or are you a project athlete? And the ability to choose that is something that's very contemporary. That did not exist in the 80s, 90s, or even the early 2000s. Like, I'll give all the credit in the world to the media engines of Red Bull and others like them that helped that become an opportunity for athletes now and people that want to play in these different disciplines. And then in an indirect way, COVID really taught us how much we all want to be spoon-fed content constantly, when we were locked up in our homes. And so all of a sudden there was this ability where, yeah, I'm not going to go after a podium, but I have a really incredible, FKT or any other endeavor I want to do, that we can create content that we can, again, bridge between that athlete and brand. And so there, in my eyes, there's so much more opportunity for athletes now.
Yeah,
Legends.
it's funny, right? Like, you're looking, when you're at the brand, you're looking for athletes that are the most congruent to make that conversation easy.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing I would say is, when Sharkey and I were early stages in our careers, when we had to make the jump of, am I going to be an athlete or am I going to be in the industry? It was a much starker difference between the two. You had to pick one or the other.
Yes.
And I think the thing that's special now, to just build on your point, is that you can actually have both worlds. And there is sort of this spectrum between project and performance athlete where you don't have to be one or the other. And you can be a high level athlete and have some level of media output or have some level of project output, where that wasn't really an option up until somewhat recently. And this is where things get really interesting, because you don't have to rely on a single focus. You can spread things wider and also set yourself up for success. When I first got to Red Bull and, we had to graduate athletes, most of them did not have a plan B. They really didn't know what they were going to do. They kind of had to start from the bottom again in a lot of cases. Whereas now, a lot of the athletes that are kind of moving on from brands have that next thing. At least in my experience, I'm seeing athletes have a better plan B or next step that's a bit more obvious. And I think that media and content play a big role of that. Even if you don't have your own, podcast, or you don't have your own YouTube channel, you've had this ability to be exposed to a lot more of the production, a lot more of the storytelling, project building, etc. And you have a skill set. If you were paying any attention whatsoever, you at least have a bit more skill set than you would have had you left the sport 10 years ago, just say.
Yeah, no, so true. I mean, the ownership of your own brand has been one of my favorite things that I've seen happen for athletes over the last 10 years. Like, it used to be entirely like, look at the roster of the North Face, 135 global athletes. And, you would have to fight tooth and nail to get into a campaign and to show up, in store on the wall or be in a campaign. And now, with the thanks to, Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, like you can own your own brand, and hopefully your brand partners help accentuate that and vice versa. But the ability to control your own destiny in that way is, I think, a wonderful thing and something totally unique to contemporary times.
What a great lesson. So maybe winding down, speaking of proactivity, owning your own destiny, having initiative, following curiosity. Tell us what you're up to now. I know you can't go into a ton of detail, but it's it seems like another big pivot for you. So enlighten the audience about that and we'll get to BPC.
Sure. So I'm currently CMO for a startup in health tech that will be in market sometime in the next 3 to 6 months. It is a total departure from anything I've done to date, in that it is 100% based in neuroscience. And I am not a neuroscientist by trade. So I have once again put myself in the uncomfortable space of learning something far outside of my aperture. And it's been an incredible process building the brand from the ground up and learning and meeting incredible people all over the world as a result. The way that it even came on my radar, or I came on theirs, there are elite level athletes that are currently using and testing the device and around a hand-eye coordination level. So Formula One drivers and tennis players in particular. There will be implications for sport. There will be implications for people just trying to get better sleep in their life. It's been incredible to build something from scratch with a great team and a great team of global partners on the agency side. It's good to get out of your comfort zone, no matter what your age is, and learn something new. So
Rad. Lucy, any closing comments before we get to BPC, or closing questions for Sharkey?
Sharkey, we got to have you back. We got to riff on stuff because we've worked in so much of the same stuff, and I feel like we kind of went through and did the primer, but man, like I want to include you in some of the discussions, and
I'd be honored to, because to be honest, I have you guys on the pod as I'm hiking or I'm running or I'm on my bike. And every time I listen, I find myself like out loud bantering between the two of you. I love the discussions. I love the subjects you guys are crossing on, and I'd be happy to be back anytime you want me.
Yeah, you sent us some stuff about that Nike ad, and then you just mentioned on the podcast your strength is in brand and storytelling. I think it'd be great to just do a full podcast just on brand, But then also we've had this debate, or the last couple of weeks been talking about the brand marketing versus performance marketing. You said that you're trying to learn more of like the performance and growth side of things. So there's so much more to dig into. You also mentioned, American made products, something I actually am interested, passionate about too. And you have experience with at least American Giant. So there's so much more to get into, but we've got plenty more episodes to come in the future. You're our guest here. You know how we close the show: brand, product, content. Leave our listeners with something interesting to
Yeah, no, out. I think it's a hard one. I love listening to you guys riff on this weekly, because of all the things that are out there in the world. There is so much to hone in on. So this is, I love that you end it this way, because I think it's kind of one of the things I look forward to most on each of the conversations. You got to get through all the other great meat and potatoes. One that I'm going to come back to on the trail running side most recently that I've seen is 100 Reasons Why, which was Terex's Western States video that I took in, a week ago. What I love about it and what I'll be critical about. I think what I love about it is they did a better job than I've seen most ever capture the spirit of Western States, for sure. And I think that when you look at trail running particular, everybody knows it is an individual pursuit, but a team sport. And that's really coming down to your pacers and your crew. But I thought that they took a really unique perspective in covering the entire team that was going to be, on trail that day. which was a unique perspective. Most of the time that we see content around that race, which is my favorite sporting event of each year. So I'll share that much with the audience as well.
You and your son hiked the escarpment
We
at 4
did,
o'clock
yeah.
in the morning.
He turned 18 during the golden hour, and that was just an incredible weekend to spend together. But seeing it beautifully captured, internal and external team, hat tip to them on that. I really love looking at the full team of athletes and that whole story around the brand and how they showed up there. I think where I can be critical of it in a constructive criticism way is anytime that a brand puts out a video, you also have to walk that delicate balance of it becoming a commercial for your brand versus a branded content piece. And so that's delicate dance, which I felt like they did a decent job of throughout. But one area that I think we often miss, and I'll take responsibility for this as well historically, within endurance sports and outdoor sports, product marketing is a deficit. I think that we really focus on brand, we really focus on athlete, but we really miss the opportunity to connect around product a lot of the time. And especially when you're working on, unique technologies, being able to weave those stories in more to your content and to your brand storytelling, I think is an area that outdoor and endurance sports can do better on for sure. And so, it's a beautiful piece, captures the energy, the spirit, the story of the athletes, and takes them from Herzo to Auburn, which is really cool to do in a 30-minute piece. So that's mine for the week.
I haven't watched it yet, but I have it up in a tab here on my computer. Adidas Terex, 100 Reasons Why. Western States 100. Awesome. I think that was probably done by the Rabbit Wolf creative guys. They're awesome. Yeah. Steve Kirsch and his partner, whose name I can't remember. But anyway, they do a lot of great trail running stuff. Yeah. Shout out to those guys. Yeah. You next, Lutzi.
I think that's the first BPC where someone delivered the positive and, I've never, that's kind of interesting. That gives a little extra layer to it. Like, I love this about it, but also this is something that's interesting.
I guess that's just the critical eye of being responsible for the marketing org. I can't help myself.
I dig it. I think it's a good perspective and just adds a bit more depth to it. It's not all sunshine and rainbows, it's cool to have that little extra detail. Well, Sharkey, since you have the photography thing going on, I picked a BPC that I thought was one of the most incredible photography projects over the last couple of weeks. It's called Layers of the Games. Have you guys seen this?
Mm-mm.
Okay. So Hector Vivas is a Getty Images photographer. And what he did over the course of the Olympic Games, in addition to shooting some pretty epic photos in general, he did this project throughout the games and through multiple sports called Layers of the Games. And basically what it is, it's a composite image of the game. And so you have an image of the soccer game, but it's like players all over the field. And it's all the most impactful moments of that game, but smashed into one image. So he does it with soccer, with volleyball, with rock climbing, with balance beam, like all of the different sports have like a sequence just all in one composite image. And it was inspired by the work of Pele Cass. His quote was that this visually synthesizes the most important moments of a competition, a race, or game in a single image, like a kind of time lapse in still photography. I set technical rules such as I cannot move objects around. What appears in a certain place in the photo will be there in the final frame. The editing project is digital by layers. This is where the name of the project comes from, as it's a technique I use to couple the photos. It's pretty cool. I'll send it to you guys.
Very cool.
The overlap of sport and art.
Yeah. Well, it's also like you can
center the bullseye for us.
You can look at this photo and really just appreciate any sport. You don't have to care about any of them. It's just another way to access the Olympics.
Mm-hmm.
It's so cool.
Very cool. I'm definitely checking that out. Thanks.
Rad. Yeah, likewise. Okay, closing us down here, guys, in what feels like an appropriate manner. We have a thread going between the three of us where Sharkey put a few book recommendations, and I bought them, and I started reading Build by Tony Fadell last night. Mm-hmm. I'm 20 pages deep. I'm already obsessed with it, and the last few years of my career have been centered around storytelling, building a media business, and I want eventually to come around to the product part of my career. And it's something that I'm sort of, triangulating towards right now. And this book seems to have found me at a perfect time. But I'm going to read a short excerpt here to send us off away from the episode today that hopefully will inspire our listeners. This comes from page number 5, so very early in the book. It's a good hook. And what Tony Fadell says, we should say, Tony Fadell is an icon of Silicon Valley, instrumental in building consumer products like the iPod, the iPhone, the Nest thermostats, things that integrate both software and hardware. And what he says here early in the book is the best way to find a job that you'll love and a career that will eventually make you successful is to follow what you're naturally interested in, then take risks when choosing where to work. Follow your curiosity rather than a business school playbook about how to make money. Assume that for much of your 20s, your choices will not work out and the companies you will join or start will likely fail. Early adulthood is about watching your dreams go up in flames and learning as much as you can from the ashes. Do, fail, learn. The rest will follow. So anyway, Build by Tony Fadell. I'm only 20 pages in. That's my BPC this week. But I think a good lesson for all of us, right? None of us are in our 20s anymore, but, there's a lot of wisdom in that of just like, follow your interest, be proactive, as Sharkey has left us with today, and always be learning, and eventually, the rest will follow, as Tony Fadell says.
Indeed. And you don't have to be in your 20s, Debo. Like you're reinventing yourself, as you hit that 40 mark. So, we can always choose when and how we're going to do it.
Yeah. And likewise, you going into health tech now as a CMO coming from skating and outdoor and CPG. Yeah. Anyway. Well, what a great convo, boys. Obviously, we could go on forever. We'll close it down there. But round 1 with Matt, Sharkey. Aaron, any closing comments from you?
That's it. That's all. That was everything I hoped it was going to be.
Thanks, guys. No, thank you guys so much. We'll love to chat with you anytime you want.